If you've been keeping up with recent conversations, which were sparked by the Adobe Developers Conference in February, one of the questions you might be asking yourself is, can I downgrade my Adobe Commerce store to Magento open source? The direction Adobe is taking commerce, with an increasing amount of functionality moving to SaaS services, is certainly not going to be for everyone, and you might even be feeling Magento's future is unclear enough at this stage to be thinking about migrating to another e-commerce framework altogether. However, the future of Magento open source is perhaps now looking more certain than Adobe Commerce, in terms of the framework and functionality as we currently know it anyway. So if you want to make sure that you keep that level of customization that comes with Magento and don't want to potentially be forced into using less customizable SaaS functionality, then downgrading from Adobe Commerce to Magento open source could actually be a pretty good option for you. So firstly, I want to say a quick bit about me. So what gives me any level of authority to talk about the complex development task of downgrading Adobe Commerce to Magento open source? Well, I'm a Magento developer myself. I've been developing Magento professionally since 2010, starting as far back as Magento Community Edition 1.3. So I've extensively developed both paid and free versions of Magento 1 and 2, and I've personally performed a commerce to open source downgrade for one of my clients. Here I built the downgrade process right from the initial research and testing to preparing a fully custom documented downgrade process, to countless hours of testing and staging and local environments to confirm the process works ahead of time, to actually performing the downgrade on a production system. The installer downgraded has been operating as open source without issue for many months now, and I know that the process I created can be applied to any Adobe Commerce store, and that's why I wanted to share my findings with you today. So how did I go about preparing for the downgrade? Well, the first thing I did was review and test all the information I could find about downgrading commerce to open source that already existed. There's a couple of different guides out there, and they're noted in the documentation I produced, but I found there was really one primary key area that was missing from all of them, and that was considering the fact that there are considerable differences between the database structure of commerce and open source. So this basically meant that none of the guides were any good for a store with existing data. So I went through these and I tested all of these existing solutions. The end result was unfortunately a completely broken open source store. So downgrading the code base is really the easy part. So changes to the database that make it a difficult task, and these guides largely only covered downgrading the code base. So of course it's easy, isn't it, to upgrade from open source to commerce, but Adobe are never going to make it easy going the other way, and that might be why these database changes exist. How did I actually perform a downgrade? After all the research and testing of existing solutions, at that point it was clear that we were going to need a completely custom downgrade process. So I started a full analysis of the actual requirements and documented it all as I went. What I found was that downgrading the Magento core code base was simple with Composer, but there were challenges around, firstly, existing third and first party extensions. So would they be fully compatible with open source? Was there any dependency on commerce? Secondly, replacing commerce only functionality with third-party open source extensions. So how do we go about migrating the existing commerce database tables worth of data and have it work correctly with a third-party extension? Thirdly, there's a multitude of fundamental database differences between open source and commerce. So about the existing third and first party extensions, here I had to consider how existing third and first party extensions worked, primarily thinking about any functionality which relates to or requires commerce only data or classes, and I'd have to make necessary changes in those extensions to make sure it worked under open source. Next, replacing commerce functionality. So the initial research, the main areas for consideration for my client were companies and returns functionality offered by commerce. So in this case, Amnesty modules were decided on to replace the commerce functionality because firstly the functionality of these modules were good, and also the structure of the tables that the extensions created were close to the commerce equivalent, so particularly with companies where the table structure was near identical. So this made data migration from commerce to open source with these modules easier. The differences between the databases. So I went through the databases for commerce and open source with a fine-tooth comb, table by table, to determine all of the differences, which, as you can imagine, did take quite some time. But the main differences it revealed were that there were quite a few tables that had a different name for the primary key column, and this primary key column is a main way in which each record in the table is referenced by Magento. So it's according to the data in that column. So if the name of that data, if that column changes, then you can no longer reference that row. I also found significant differences around foreign keys, which are used to define links between different database tables. So what was the approach that I took to formulate this custom downgrade process? Well, the only way to ensure success in downgrading was to very thoroughly collate all of my findings into a solid plan containing both the code changes and the database changes that were needed. So the end goal was to have an open source install with all traces of commerce completely removed, so Adobe couldn't argue that the install still needed a commerce license. So I documented it all thoroughly, and I produced a document of around 130 pages. I committed the needed code changes ahead of time into a downgrade branch of the repository, and produced all of the SQL scripts needed to downgrade a database. And I did this as transactions, so if something did go wrong, the database changes wouldn't be partially applied, which would break the downgrade process. So after that, it was just a case of test again with dummy data in local and staging environments. Having done all this, when it came to actually downgrading production, everything was backed up just in case a rollback was needed, and then I performed the actual downgrade. Thankfully, due to the amount of preparation that went into the process, the downgrade went smoothly, and many months later the store is still running without issue on open source. How can you downgrade your store then if you want to do that? So if you want to downgrade your store from Adobe Commerce to Magento open source, I've proven it can be done. However, to complete this highly complex process of downgrading successfully does require close attention to detail from a competent and experienced developer. To give you a massive head start, I have made the documentation and database scripts I created available to all, and you can find them linked to in the blog post associated to this video. It is important, however, to note that you probably won't just be able to apply exactly what I've done to your store. It will get you 95% of the way there, but the key thing to do is test thoroughly and then customize as needed before any downgrade is performed on a production install. If you'd like to have a conversation about me performing the downgrade for you, given my experience of already having done it before, feel free to drop me a message using the developer connection contact form, and I'll be sure to pick that up. Or if you want to use one of the highly competent developers who list with us a developer connection to perform your downgrade instead, you can create a project with a few minutes and a couple of clicks at developerconnection.co.uk. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.